Ladies and gentlemen, it's a new dawn, it's a new day, it's a new year, and we're still talking about Assassin's Creed. So one of my first videos to ever hit 1,000 views was my ranking of the Assassin's Creed series back in 2020. And since then, we've spoken a lot about the series. I've replayed basically every game in the series, and I've had a lot of time to reflect on this franchise. And after the release of Assassin's Creed Valhalla back in November, I looked back at my old ranking and realized something. I was wrong. I was so very wrong. So today we're going to make a few fixes to that past video. We're going to reorganize my list and of course see where Valhalla stands in relation to the series. And hopefully we're going to come to a conclusive decision on which Assassin's Creed game is the best and which is the worst. Coming in last, maybe surprisingly to some people, is the game that turned Assassin's Creed into a 90s cartoon sitcom. After the launch failure of Unity, Syndicate was essentially Ubisoft's attempt at damage control, and ironically, it ended up being so much worse. The combat, for one, is one of the least enjoyable game mechanics I've ever experienced, being the least varied and least engaging in the entire series. Without combos, parries, or gadgets, the combat is basically simplified down to a 3-button system, as you tediously mash attack until your enemy is covered head to toe in scratches and bruises, occasionally dodging bullets or breaking your enemy's defense. Now of course, this doesn't provide any actual challenge, as it's completely mastered by simply learning the patterns of the limited variety of NPCs. Along with it being tedious and easy though, it also doesn't benefit at all from its cartoonish, repetitive animations that make you feel more like a Looney Tunes character than a deadly assassin. Now, I would say that the stealth system in comparison is absolutely fantastic. However, the design of black box stealth missions in Syndicate is rigidly linear, going against the entire point of being free and open. And this hand-holding is a trend throughout the entire game, whether it's invisible walls that stop you from jumping off roofs, or AI horses that will ride your carriage for you. Not that any of that matters though, because as we all know, the movement system was absolutely crucified by the introduction of the rope launcher. Then there's the content itself, most of which is made up of Mafia 3-esque burra segments that are made up of the same 4 missions, repeated 40 times across the oversized, shallow world of London. And of course, you have the story of Syndicate, which is, well...
Oh, what's this, Greenie? Assassin Christmas.
Sticking with the theme of sitcoms, Syndicate's entire story is built on a ludicrous premise, filled with characters that constantly act as if they're self-aware that they're in a game. Combine that with the mustache-twirling evil capitalist, and it honestly would make a pretty decent pantomime. But to put it simply, Syndicate feels like a complete parody of Assassin's Creed, filled with near unplayable gameplay and a story that makes me want to throw myself headfirst out a 4-story window. To this day, I honestly can't still believe that this game exists. Assassin's Creed Odyssey, for all intents and purposes, isn't an Assassin's Creed game. And for that reason, along with plenty others, it's the most polarizing game in the series. Of course, the game contains next to none of the elements that made the series what it is today. No assassins, no Templars, no hidden blade, no social stealth, none of it. And for that reason alone, it automatically falls near the bottom of my list. But even as a game in itself, without that AC label attached, it's still fucking abysmal. Some people try to make the claim that Odyssey is a bad AC game but a good RPG, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Odyssey completely fails as an RPG, with broken and unbalanced leveling that forces the player to buy microtransactions, dull repetitive side missions that plague the world of Greece, which in itself is atmospherically dead, structuring that allows for unsatisfying narrative arcs, and worst of all, an empty husk of a character that provides nothing to the game except a fuck ton of ludonarrative dissonance. What it does wrong, it does horrendously wrong, and what it does right, well, there's not much of that. But I do think the game is slightly more redeemable than Syndicate. Its combat has the same unbalanced and tedious elements as you slowly grind through waves of enemies, however the game at least provides some variety in weapon types, engravings and enemy types. Along with that, the world side content, although still repetitive and boring, is slightly less mind-numbing than the formulaic checklist of Syndicate. Odyssey 2 at least tried to bring in some kind of modern day storyline, and although it largely shits on the series' past lore, it at least actually makes you you feel something, which is something I can't say for Syndicate. Odyssey at a foundational level is a terrible, terrible game, filled to the brim with lazy design, scummy business practice, and an all-round lack of care. And on top of that, it took the series that so many loved and essentially stomped it into the ground, which is more than enough for it to warrant one of the last places on this list. Now, I know this one will upset a lot of people, because Assassin's Creed 3 was the first game a lot of fans of this franchise played, but as someone who played it from the very start, from someone who was massively hyped for AC3 to finally release, I can say that it was truly a disappointment, and it's by no means aged well. I like to describe AC3 as a barrage of new concepts and ideas, all executed badly, whether it be the new animation-based parkour system that simplified movement, the Arkham-inspired combat system that held your hand, or the new lighting systems that made everything look like they were covered in a layer of mud. Most of these gameplay issues are present throughout the entire game and can be traced back to the Anvil Next engine. And although they stand out as downgrades, what really tears AC3 down is its abysmal narrative. For some reason, around this time, Ubisoft decided that instead of telling a story within the historical context of the period, they'd simply recount every major historical event they could and turn their game into a revolutionary war simulator, led by the most boring character in the series to date. And no, it's not just because he's stoic, it's not just because he has a monotone voice. I mean, have you heard me? No, Connor's a terrible protagonist because of his lack of any type of development. Instead of actually following his motivations and beliefs, Connor throughout the entire game simply acts as a pawn, pushed around and used by George Washington as an indestructible force against the British. After finding out that George Washington ordered the attack that killed his mother, for example, he simply continues to fight against Charles Lee. He begins the game as a naive child, driven by a single motivation, and he ends the game as a naive adult, driven by a single motivation. Without any real arc, no true story can be told. Themes of chaos and order can be thrown about, sure, we can see monumental historical events, but we can never truly connect to Connor's journey in any meaningful way. And of course, we can't forget that the game ends with a modern day climax that, although somewhat satisfyingly puts an end to one story, opened up countless others that Ubisoft had no plans to continue. I truly can't see why many people love this game, because compared to recent years, AC3 does feel far more true to what the series is. With all its flaws though, I can't call it anything except a major letdown. I look at Assassin's Creed Rogue as the absolute baseline for an Assassin's Creed game. The measuring stick of sorts for the rest of the series. The game you can point to and say, yeah, it's alright. Everything above AC Rogue on this list I can say that I truly love, and everything below it I can say that I have a dislike for. Rogue itself though doesn't really fall into either camp. Despite not being promoted at all as a side game, many people consider it one, and at times it definitely feels like it fits that description, with its short forgettable story bringing little in the way of interesting plot points or characters. Apart from of course the darky edgy e-boy of the Assassin's Creed universe, Shay Patrick Cormac. The way Rogue handles its spin on the Assassin Templar conflict is surface level at best, with the two orders essentially just switching roles as to connect with the gameplay, which itself is a complete copy and paste of Black Flag's. Like, it's the exact same game with some added snow. And copying Black Flag's gameplay without the story to match, it ends up being tough to justify playing Rogue when there's such a better option available. I honestly don't hate Rogue, I don't even dislike it, but it does so little that it's actually kind of laughable. I appreciate what Ubisoft Sofia were able to do with the resources they were given, but at the end of the day, the game provides nothing new, and everything it does well is done better in other entries, leaving it as the most forgettable and bland game to ever grace this franchise. Wow, so this one fell a lot. Yeah, back in 2020, I did say that Assassin's Creed Origins was the third best game in the franchise. Yikes. Now don't get me wrong, as opposed to some people, Walshie, I do still genuinely have some love for Origins, in spite of its worsening reputation over the years. The game rejuvenated a love for the franchise that I had lost, and having only played it a couple of times in the peak of its hype, I definitely looked at it with rose-tinted glasses. However, on replay, the flaws of Origins are far more glaring. Starting with the narrative, the origin story itself is hugely shallow, with the philosophical depth of the likes of Assassin's Creed 1 being nowhere to be found, replaced instead with vague gestures to iconography, as well as the characters constantly talking about a creed, despite, you know, a creed never actually being created. Now of course, I still adore Bayek and his personal journey, as Abubakar Salim still puts much of this game on his back, but one brilliant performance simply isn't enough to make up for the shallow side characters, uninteresting villains, cringeworthy lines, and horrendously messy pacing. The shifting paradigm of gameplay also saw glimpses of greatness be dragged down by a lack of depth. The combat system is foundationally decent, but lacks any true difficulty outside of basic damage scaling. The crafting system provides incentive to explore the gorgeous world, but is linear and limited in its design. The gear systems all work well enough, but there's not enough variety to truly engage it in any meaningful way. The RPG elements are shallow. The classic AC elements are shallow. The origin story is shallow. Bayek and I's relationship is you know what? I think you get the point. Origins had the potential to be one of the best games in the series, one of the first to match up to the Ezio trilogy, but in retrospect, despite Bayek still being one of the best protagonists in the franchise, the game itself definitely missed the mark, and will be remembered as being good, but not even close to being great. Speaking of missing the mark, people always get mad at me about this one. Coming in at number 7 on this list is the embodiment of wasted potential. But regardless of what Assassin's Creed Unity lacked, I love it nonetheless. And that love stems almost totally from the gameplay, which to me recaptures the Assassin fantasy better than any game in the series since the first. The defensive, engaging combat, the black box assassination missions that are handcrafted to make the player truly engage in the stealth system, the only engaging parkour system outside of the first 4 games, which fits the gorgeous world of Paris perfectly, a wider customization system than we'd ever seen, side content that embraces French history whilst also providing fully fledged storylines that don't simply climax in bandit camps, the co-op missions that flesh out the world of Paris and provide even more replayability to a game that's already stuffed with content. It's all wrapped up into the most visually stunning package that the series has provided to date. I truly do believe that this foundation of Unity is the best we've seen this entire generation. However, the game is not some underrated masterpiece as some would have you believe. In fact, Unity's been called underrated so many times that it might just be becoming a bit overrated. First and foremost, as just about the entire world knows, Unity came out completely unfinished. Like, unplayably unfinished. The bugs, the glitches, the terrible frame rates, and the game-breaking issues that despite the patches still exist from many today do continue to bring this game's potential down. And just because maybe you didn't experience those glitches, it doesn't mean they don't exist. But what brings Unity down even more is its massively underwhelming main story, which at the end of the day is arguably the most important aspect of any Assassin's Creed game. Unity's narrative does begin fantastically, with Arno being introduced as a genuinely interesting character that had clear motivations. However, as the game goes on, it falls into a pit of dull, confusing plot points and badly paced arcs. From Balek's betrayal that comes less than halfway through the game, to the mess that is the Grand Master plotline, to the unremarkable relationship Arno has with Elise, it's all let down by a lack of development for any supporting characters and a lack of any coherent character arc for Arno, who literally has the exact same drunken stupor moment twice throughout the game. The themes of fanaticism and the dangers of ideologues are all there, but they're never presented in a focused and well-developed narrative. And considering the game's story is one of the shortest in the series, it's clear that it had so much more potential than what was delivered. Personally, I have loved Assassin's Creed Unity since the day it was released, and I'll continue to love it. But I can't simply pick and choose the things I enjoy, disregarding the glaring flaws. It genuinely had the potential to be on par with the best the series had to offer, and maybe if it had another year or two in development it would have been. But what Unity actually is just isn't enough to place it any higher on this list. I was split for a long time over where I considered Assassin's Creed Valhalla to stand in this series. Was it the game-changing return to form that many thought it was, or was it an underwhelming waste of time like so many others said? Well, I'm a filthy fence-sitter and I stand somewhere in between. If you've seen my Valhalla review, you know that I have a lot of issues with this game. From the countless structural and pacing issues the story holds, to the Odyssey-esque combat, Valhalla has plenty of flaws that weigh it down from truly being a top-tier game in the series. That being said though, what Valhalla does get right, it gets better than most of the other games in the series. In spite of its structural flaws and bloated runtime, the narrative still holds countless brilliant moments and characters. Whether it be the Sussex rescue, the entirety of the Jorvik and Winchester arcs, or Ivar's descent into evil. Along with that, the game provides the most in-depth modern day and Isu storyline since 2011, wrapping up 10 years worth of plotlines and mysteries while still creating an intriguing thread for future games to follow up on. The world as well is one of the best in the series for exploration, with each town being unique uniquely handcrafted, and every corner of England, Vinland, and Norway providing new missions, characters, and details that create a genuinely immersive and interesting experience, as opposed to the formulaic side content of the likes of Syndicate and Odyssey. Valhalla is most certainly a divisive game, mainly due to its exhaustive length, but despite its flaws, it's one of a select few games in the series that I can say doesn't feel shallow, doesn't feel like it's afraid to explore the series it's a part of. Like I said, Valhalla is nowhere near perfect, and I completely understand why a fair few people have a distaste for it, but to me it's the closest thing we got to greatness this entire generation, and for that reason I can say that at the very least it deserves a spot in the top half of this list. So I've had a rocky relationship with Assassin's Creed Black Flag over the years. When the game first released back in 2013, I absolutely adored it. I was borderline addicted to replaying it over and over again. As time went on though, my love for it severely faded, as I began to see cracks in this seemingly brilliant game. Cracks that pushed me to rank it below Unity the last time I did this. Obviously, that was an overreaction, but to be honest, I still believe Black Flag to be pretty heavily overrated. Don't get me wrong, it is fantastic, but people far too often overlook the issues the game has. The inconsistent and at times broken parkour, the ridiculously easy combat, the terrible enemy AI, the repetitive side content, and worst of all, the horrendous mission structure, stuffed to the brim with dull downtailing missions and, well, very little else to be perfectly honest. Hearing all that, it probably sounds like I despise AC4, but in all honesty, it makes sense why these flaws are so often overlooked, because everything else in Black Flag is fucking spectacular. Of course, the naval gameplay is AC4's most praised system, and for good reason. It truly was a revolutionary mechanic that nailed the pirate fantasy, as well as giving the player a breath of fresh air from the general assassin gameplay. And on top of that, it provided a genuine difficulty curve that rewarded tactical upgrades and exploration of the world. The naval and of course the narrative are what make Black Flag so special, and once again Darby McDevitt pulled off some magic, with the help of a cast of brilliantly performed characters that all bring their unique dynamics to Edward's story, which in itself is a beautiful redemption arc that never rushes itself, but at the same time doesn't at all feel half-baked. Plus, the introduction of sages was an idea that added a brilliant new layer to the modern day, and despite the modern day's first-person mediocrity, it does actually have a decent mini-story with a great twist to cap it off. Black Flag, not unlike the rest of the series, is a game with too many flaws to ignore. However, its flaws never feel like they ruin the experience. They're consistently overshadowed by the parts of the game that are brilliant. It's a unique, concise, and fun experience that's able to embrace the assassin philosophy without feeling weighed down by it, and it truly is in the upper echelon of Assassin's Creed. With every year that passes, I become increasingly more aware that Assassin's Creed 1 is a game that's either been forgotten or simply never experienced by a massive section of the series' fanbase. I mean, it's almost at the point of officially being considered retro, which just makes me feel so old. But despite this declining widespread appreciation, Assassin's Creed 1's impact is still felt to this day, and what it did in terms of laying a foundation for the series is near perfect. The philosophy of the Creed, specifically the nuanced back and forths Altair has with his targets in the White Room, is the key to what makes that Assassin vs Templar conflict so interesting. And the way Al-Mualim plays both sides, manipulating his followers for personal gain, beautifully introduced the moral grey area between the two sides. Whilst later games somewhat idealise the Assassins as the good guys and the Templars as the bad, Assassin's Creed 1 instead focused on balance between the two, on the balance between chaos and order, and the importance of both sides to maintain peace. And through its subtle storytelling, we see Altair and many of his allies come to realise that the dogma of ideologues results in nothing but bloodshed, an arc which of course is linked directly to the 12th Crusade setting, giving the world a feeling of importance and necessity, as opposed to just existing because Ubisoft needed another historical game to up their quarterly profit margins. Every aspect of the game has a clear care put into it, from the intimidating feeling of entering a city, the handcrafted assassination missions filled with pathways in and out of your target's location, and of course the intriguing modern day segments that lay countless mysteries to be followed up on in future games. The game gives you a glimpse of this universe whilst providing the assassin fantasy arguably better than any other game, and everything in the game is designed to serve that fantasy, even the repetitive mission design that so many people complain about. Assassin's Creed 1 was my introduction to the series, and I'm so glad it was, as it firmly set a series identity that I immediately fell in love with, an identity that's never quite been captured just as brilliantly. And here we reach the predictable top 3. Because of course, the Ezio trilogy is not only far and away the peak of this series, but there's a fair argument that it's the best trilogy of games ever. But there has to be a worst, and that's gotta be Revelations. Now, AC Revelations was never actually meant to exist. Originally it was just gonna be a side game for the PS Vita, but luckily for us, Ubisoft made the decision to expand the project into a fully fledged finale to Ezio's story. And somehow, it just about matched the quality of the games that came before it. Given there are a fair few areas where Revelations lacks, its side content is fairly subpar, its world is by far the least detailed and lively of the trilogy, and its Assassin-Templar conflict is a downgrade from what came before. It does at times feel like Ezio's fight against the Templars was somewhat forced in by Ubisoft, but the conflict is by no means terrible. The core of what makes Revelations great though is the personal stories of Ezio, Altair and Desmond, as each of their journeys come together in one beautiful scene, a scene that truly pays off the 3 games of development that came before, a scene that connects our 3 protagonists across the span of history, with Altair and Ezio finally able to rest, knowing they've played their part in Desmond's journey to save the world from catastrophe. Along with that, you've got Ezio's relationships with Sophia, Yusuf and Suleiman, yet another cast of great supporting characters that act as Ezio's main motivations. You've got Altair's story from Assassin's Creed 1 finally given some closure as we see what became of him in his later life with the wisdom of the apple at his fingertips. You've got Desmond's life, Lucy's betrayal, Clay's backstory, all of it given the respect it deserved after being teased and hinted at for years. Revelations is possibly the most satisfyingly beautiful finale that any character has ever had, and to me it contains the best story of any Assassin's Creed game. As well, it maintains the foundational core of the games that came before it, and although it doesn't add a massive amount gameplay wise, the final chapter of Ezio's story is so perfectly executed that I can't justify it being any lower than 3rd on this list. The perfect sequel. That's what Assassin's Creed 2 is. Absolute perfection. Coming off the mixed receptions of the first game, Patrice Désilets and his team took everything from their first project and made it all 10 times better. Of course, this game saw the introduction of my favourite character of all time, Ezio Auditore, a boy who we see become a man over a 20-year journey of revenge, love and mystery. We see Ezio transform from the arrogant kid picking fights in the street to the wise assassin, coming to realise that there are far higher purposes in life than revenge. I can't put into words how perfect this character arc is, as Ezio continually grows with the help of his mentors, his brothers and sisters, the men and women who stand by his side after he loses his family to tyranny and corruption. Along the way, he nearly loses himself to his wrath. He verges on the same resent and aggression that his enemies thrive on. But thanks to the likes of Mario, Paola, La Volpe, Bartolomeo, Rosa, he's kept afloat. He's able to maintain a path of righteousness, a path that leads him to discover his higher purpose. The mission design, the biggest criticism of the first entry into the series, is also brought up to the same standard, with seemingly every mission being handcrafted to provide a unique experience, and that's not to mention the myriad of side content, such as the tombs, which perfectly utilise the near perfect parkour system, or the newly introduced economy system that allows for greater customization, a massively expanded combat system, and a safe house that truly feels like home. Honestly, what Patrice Désilets and his team did with Assassin's Creed 2 was a miracle. It was a true turning point for Ubisoft, and if it was never made, I doubt that we would have ever seen another 10 games, 9 novels, a Hollywood movie and a Netflix show. It truly was a franchise-defining game, and I don't think anyone believed that Ubisoft could top it. But you know how I said that Assassin's Creed 2 took everything AC1 did and just added to it? Yeah, well, Brotherhood took this to a whole new level. Continuing the story of Ezio, we see his hero's journey reach a tipping point, where all seems well and his battles seem won. But thanks to his decision not to kill Rodrigo, he's instead faced with disaster, with his home, our home, being burned to the ground, more of his family being killed, and him being left as a lone soldier in a world out to destroy him. Without the constant aid of his mentors, we see Ezio forced to grow into the mentor, the leader of the assassins, through his willingness to believe in ordinary people, to believe in Machiavelli, La Volpe and Claudia, and most importantly to believe in the Creed and believe in his brotherhood. And then you've got Cesare, a villain who counteracts the order and subtlety of Rodrigo in AC2. Cesare is instead an agent of chaos, a tyrant willing to crush his people by any means necessary, an unpredictable madman obsessed with power and personal gain. Cesare beautifully mirrors Ezio. He embodies the potential evil that Ezio could have become, and whilst he tears down his city through pain and suffering, Ezio instead revives Rome through hope and liberation. The story of Brotherhood is far more subtle than AC2, but it's by no means worse, and it's aided by what the game truly does best: the incredible world of Rome, stuffed with an obscene amount of side content that's all consistently brilliant. The Leonardo missions, the Christina missions, the Abstergo agents, the Thieves Guild, the Courtesan missions, renovating Rome, the Romulus tombs, the Brotherhood system, they all provide unique experiences that not only add to the world, but feed into so much of Ezio's character and to the main narrative, without ever feeling overbearing or tedious. On top of that, Brotherhood provides the best dichotomy of modern day and ancestor story that we've seen in any of the games, with Desmond and the gang having even more development, along with the truth creating so much brilliant mystery. And then it's all topped off with a haunting twist, a perfect cliffhanger, Juno forcing Desmond to kill the person he's closest with, the only person he thought he could fully trust, before collapsing in front of the apple. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood should not exist. The fact that such a masterpiece of a game could be created in only 9 months, coming straight off of AC2, is absolutely insane. And I can only applaud the team for creating such a perfect balance between every system and every narrative thread in the game. Because it's that balance that to me makes Assassin's Creed Brotherhood the best Assassin's Creed game of all time. But of course, I know there will be plenty of people out there who disagree with me, so make sure to let me know in the comments down below what you think of my list. Do you disagree? Do you agree? Do you hate my guts? Let me know down below. Also, if you did enjoy the video, make sure to hit like, it does really help me out. And if you want to see more content like this, hit subscribe and smash the living fuck out of the bell. That's the notification bell, so you know YouTube tells you when I upload, when I post, you know, so you can see it. You know what I'm saying? Gabagoo. Fuck, what the fuck was that? Once again, Happy New Year. And with all that being said, I've been Joe, aka Founder Scarab, and I'll see you in the next one.